Good morning, Tom. In my previous video, we have talked about the first person of polity and governance. Now, in this video, we're going to learn about the first person of defense, sports, awards and prizes, first woman in India, and miscellaneous. So, are you ready for it? Yes, madam. I am very much excited to learn new things, and I am ready for that. So, Tom, this question is based on defense. So, let's start. Who was the first army chief of India? Kodandira Madappa Kariyappa was the first army chief of India. Who was the first chief of air staff? Air Marshal Sir Thomas Elmhurst was the first chief of air staff. Who was the first Indian Air Chief of India? Air Marshal Subrata Mukherjee was the first Indian Air Chief of India. Who was the first Chief Army Staff? The first Chief Army Staff was General Maharaja Shri Rajendra Singh Ji Jadeja. Who was the first Field Marshal of India? General S.F.J. Manik Shaw was the first Field Marshal of India. Who was the first Chief of Naval Staff of India? The first Chief of Naval Staff of India was Vice Admiral R.D. Katari. Who was the first nuclear submarine of India? INS large-scale was the first nuclear submarine of India. Apsara was the first large-scale atomic reactor of India. Who was the first aircraft carrier Indian ship? INS Vikrant was the first aircraft carrier Indian ship. Who was the first Indian submarine? INS Kalvari was the first Indian submarine. Where is the first nuclear center? Tarapur is the first nuclear center in India. Which was the first medium-range missile of India? Agni was the first medium-range missile of India. Now, Tom, the next question is based on sports. So, let's start. Who was the first badminton player of India? Prakash Padukone was the first badminton player of India. Who was the first female player of badminton? Saina Nehwal was the first female player of badminton. Who was the first Indian female boxer to win 6 gold medals at World Championships? Mary Kom was the first Indian female boxer who won 6 gold medals at World Championship. Who was the first archery player of India? Satyadev Prasad was the first archery player of India. Who was the first Indian athlete? Kashaba Dada Saheb Jadhav was the first Indian athlete. Who was the first batsman of India? Lala Amarnath Bhardwaj was the first batsman of India. Who was the first car racer of India? Kumar Ram Narayan Karthikeyan was the first car racer of India. Where was the first Asian Games organized in India? New Delhi was the place where first Asian Game organized in India. Who was the first squash player of India? Ritvik Bhattacharya was the first squash player of India. Who was the first table tennis player of India? Achanta Sharat Kamal was the first table tennis player of India. Who was the first Indian swimmer to cross English Channel? Mihir Sen was the first Indian swimmer to cross English Channel. Who was the first Indian to win Pak Strait Ocean swimming contest? Badinath was the first Indian to win Pak Strait Ocean swimming contest. Who was the first female swimmer of India? Aditi Shah was the first female swimmer of India. Who was the first golf player of India? Jeev Milkha Singh was the first golf player of India. Who was the first billiard and snooker player of India? Pankaj Arjun Advani was the first billiard and snooker player of India. Who was the first Indian to win billiard trophy? Wilson Jones was the first Indian who won billiard trophy. Who was the first hockey player of India? Major Dhyan Chand was the first hockey player of India. Who was the first chess player of India? Vishwanathan Anand was the first chess player of India. Who was the first lawn tennis player of India? Sardar Nihal Singh was the first lawn tennis player of India. Weightlifter player of India. Karnam Maleshwari was the first female weightlifter player of India. Who was the first female wrestling player of India? Geeta Fogart was the first female wrestling player of India. Now Tom, the next question is based on awards and prizes. So, let's start. Who was the first Indian Nobel laureate? Rabindranath Tagore was the first Indian Nobel laureate who won Nobel Prize in Literature. Who was the first Indian to get Bharat Ratna Award? Dr. S. Radhakrishnan was the first Indian to get Bharat Ratna Award. Who was the first Indian to get Jnanpith Award? G. Shankar Kurup was the first Indian who got Jnanpith Award. Who was the first person to get Paramveer Chakra? Major Somnath Sharma was the first person who got Paramveer Chakra. Who was the first scientist to get Nobel Prize? C.V. Raman was the first scientist who got Nobel Prize. Who was the first Indian to get Stalin Award? Saifuddin Kichlew was the first Indian to get Stalin Award. Who was the first Indian to win Magsaysay Award? Acharya Vinoba Bhava was the first Indian who won Magsaysay Award. Who was the first woman to get Ashoka Chakra? Nirja Bhanut was the first woman who got Ashoka Chakra. Who was the first Indian author to get Anderson Award? Ruskin Bond was the first Indian author who got Anderson Award. Who was the first woman Chief Minister of a state in India? Suchita Kripalani, UP, was the first woman Chief Minister of a state in India. Who was the first woman Governor of Free India? Sarojini Naidu was the first woman Governor of Free India. Who was the first woman Judge in India? Anna Chandi was the first woman Judge in India. Who was the first woman Judge in Supreme Court of India? Meera Sahib Fatima Bibi was the first woman Judge in Supreme Court of India. Who was the first woman IPS officer? Kiran Bedi was the first woman IPS officer. Who was the first Indian woman to become Miss World? Sushmita Sen was the first Indian woman to become Miss World. Who was the first woman to get Jnanpith? Ashapurna Devi was the first woman to got Jnanpith. Who was the first Indian woman go to space? Kalpana Chawla was the first Indian woman who went into the space. Who was the first woman president of India? Pratibha Devi Singh Patil was the first Indian woman president of India. Who was the first woman to win the Booker Prize? Arundhati Roy was the first woman who won the Booker Prize. Who was the first Indian person to climb Mount Everest without oxygen cylinder? Shipra Pu Dorji was the first Indian person to climb Mount Everest without oxygen cylinder? Who was the first man to climb Mount Everest twice? Nawang Gombu Sherpa was the first man who climbed Mount Everest twice. Who was the first person to make printing press popular in India? James Hickey was the first person to make printing press popular in India. Who was the first person to reach Antarctica? Late Ramcharan was the first Indian person who reached Antarctica. Name the first satellite of India. Aryabhatta was the first satellite of India. Very good, Tom. इससे यह पता चलता है कि मेहनत करने वाले हमेशा सफल होते हैं। तुम हर रोज पढ़ा करो और ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा जानकारी प्राप्त करते रहो। दोस्तों, अगर आपको ये वीडियो अच्छी लगी तो प्लीज़ लाइक, सब्सक्राइब और शेयर करना ना भूलें और बेल आइकन पे ज़रूर प्रेस करें। इसकी आगे की वीडियो आपको मिलती रहेगी। और अगर इस वीडियो में कोई भी कठिनाई आपको लगी है तो आप कमेंट सेक्शन पे ज़रूर लिखें। धन्यवाद।